Okay, so welcome back to our course on science, religion and atheism, where we're looking at the way the science-religion narrative looks from different perspectives, atheistic, agnostic and theistic, across a range of disciplines. And it's tremendous now to have Dr Mark Vernon to speak on an agnostic's perspective on the philosophy of science and religion. Mark is a journalist, author and broadcaster with degrees in physics and theology and PhD in philosophy. He writes for The Guardian, Times Literary Supplement, Church Times, Tablet and other publications. His last short series on BBC Radio 4 was entitled In Doubt We Trust. Echoes there of some other thing, I've no doubt. He's honorary fellow at Birkbeck College, London, and he's written a number of books, and we've been trying to get them to the bookstall. I can't guarantee that they've arrived yet, but How to Be an Agnostic, for example, and a number of other books. And one coming out in May, which we obviously haven't got yet, called The Big Questions, God. And he's currently working with Fraser Watt's group in the Divinity faculty on embodied cognition. So it's tremendous to have you with us, Mark, and look forward to your talk.
Yeah, perhaps just a bit to say about an agnostic's perspective. I feel slightly fraudulent talking to this title because I'm a fairly sort of religiously inclined agnostic, I must say, but hopefully something of that will come out during the course of the talk. I really feel that religion is a way of life rather than a set of beliefs, so that's my kind of excuse. And also I think the word agnosticism has certain value because one of the bits of the theological tradition which I very much value is the so-called apophatic tradition, the idea that everything that we say about God is a failure, although we have to keep trying, if you like. And I feel this has been more or less forgotten in the modern world, actually. And we're going through a period of quite deep religious change, I think, where I think probably apophatic notions may at least attempt to make a bit of a comeback. New atheism is but a skirmish in a much wider transformation, I suspect. So there are many agnostics as much as there are many kinds of atheists and theists, in fact, too. So that's something that perhaps where I'm coming from. The notion that physics might possibly have meaning for human beings is as old as physics itself, and it's physics that I'm going to mostly be talking about this morning. The ancient Greeks, for example, did natural philosophy not just to learn about the world, but to learn how to live. In the medieval period, Aristotelian cosmology became so tightly knitted to scholastic theology that it caused Galileo all sorts of problems, as we know. And then in the modern period, Newton's discoveries led to a reassessment again of what it is to be human. And today, the new physics evokes a powerful sense of mystery, I think. For others, it suggests perhaps uncanny resonances with traditional religious beliefs. But even for those who reject that kind of speculation, there is this pressing question which Einstein nicely captured in his phrase, cosmic religion. When he said, this phrase here, I maintain that the cosmic religious feeling is the strongest and noblest motive for scientific research. So this question of cosmic religion, you might say, is quite firmly on the agenda now, even if only to reject it. However, if you turn to physicists, which is basically what I'm trying to do in this presentation, to ask them what they make of this cosmic religiousness that Einstein pointed to, there's a major problem, is that it's almost the case that no two physicists come to the same sorts of conclusions. And they look at more or less exactly the same physics, but the meaning of physics for them, if you like, or at least the metaphysical speculations that they're prepared or not prepared to indulge in, really differ very dramatically. I'm going to talk in this talk about half a dozen physicists who have all kind of written not just about their physics, but more broadly about the meaning of physics for them. I don't know if you can quite see this: Stephen Weinberg, Martin Rees, Paul Davies, Roger Penrose, John Polkinghorne and Brian Swim. And it doesn't matter if you can't see that table very clearly, but broadly it just shows that whatever question you care to put to these individuals, they'll come up with a different answer that apparently has almost no bearing on their physics. So, you know, does God exist? A big no, says Stephen Weinberg. No, but, says Martin Rees. Sort of a mild no, says Paul Davies. And an even more milder no, says Roger Penrose, although he quite likes talking about God. John Polkinghorne has a big yes, of course. and then Bryanswym has a sort of modest yes. It's very hard to track what's going on here. And so it almost seems that the meaning of physics is a sort of question of metaphysical taste, you might say, that's very hard to get a handle on. Now, I think one of the things which this shows us is that what's going on in science is more than just the official science, if you like. But what's also always going on is it appeals to imagination, and the way that imagination inspires science too. And personally, I'm of the opinion that imagination has a kind of a cognitive, or certainly sort of has knowledge content, you might say. It needs discerning and all the rest of it, but and that's what's going on here. Another thing which makes it very tricky, I think, is that we're talking about trying to reconcile things which are sort of on other sides of rather a big crevasse. On the one hand is the objective, the attempt to achieve a view from nowhere, as it's sometimes put, whereas on the other is always the subjective, the fact that it's people that are doing science. There's experience versus evidence, you might say, the personal versus the empirical. And what we're engaged with in this discipline of science and religion is partly trying to bring these things together. And it's very, very hard to do, but nonetheless we must try. And the way I want to do it in my talk here is to take us on a bit of a journey. Luckily for me, I've got a friend who's a very good artist, Jeremy Wood, and he drew me this map of the meaning of physics. And my idea is that we can perhaps get some sense, at least, of what's going on here, perhaps a deeper sense, by travelling to the different, as it were, geographies that I imagine these 6 physicists seeking to inhabit. And I don't want you to take this too literally, but it's to at least try and keep in the front of mind that there's a lot more going on, as it were, than just looking at equations on a blackboard or results churning out of a computer or something. There's something about an imaginative appeal going on very profoundly in physics, I think, too. I think it's probably sort of the modern alchemy, actually, but perhaps that's to veer too much into dangerous territory so early in the morning. So if, at the very least, maybe these different terrains will have kind of heuristic value. They'll help you to remember, the kind of view that Roger Penrose takes or the kind of view that John Polkinghorne takes. But I hope also to suggest there's something about the human imagination going on as we traverse through these different terrains. As Jeremy got rather carried away with the map, and there's all sorts of details which we don't need to worry about. But what I'm going to take us through are the 6 sort of terrains in the capital letters there. We're going to begin with Godwin Forest, go to the Mystery Fens, walk up into the Potomac Heights, come to the Hills of Awareness, then move to the Gleeblan Wold. Those of you who know what glebe means will be aware of who I'm associating that with. And then we'll end up on the California coast and see what we can speculate about there. So first of all, Godwin Forest. Now this is where I imagine Stephen Weinberg living. He occupies, as it were, this deep pine woods called Godwin Forest. It's a sort of funny joke there. And for him, physics is about replacing supernatural explanations with naturalistic ones. So in such a forest, your vision is dominated by trees, or to be more precise, wood, the wood of the trunks and the wood of the grove too. And it's quite natural to assume that the world is made of one thing, plant matter and plant matter alone. Thus the forest can be said to represent a materialist vision of things. All is matter, and there's no stuff like spirits or mentality. In the forest, you're aware of animating light coming from above, but you never really see the sky, and certainly not in its entirety. So in the Weinbergian viewpoint, as it were, one's aware of limits all the time, of what can be perceived and understood. And we're creatures of the woods, you might say, and we're limited in our view of things. But just because there's much more than the eye can see, that does not imply, in this worldview, that there's a transcendent world above the canopy of perception. In fact, since woody materialism is quite adequate to account for the immanent world of the forest, there's no reason to assume that it can't account for things elsewhere too. There's no need to hypothesize things like a vitalism, for example, or a divinity. And a lot of misunderstanding arises if you do go that way. In other words, Godwin Forest is a place without gods. Now, this is not to say that Godwin Forest is a meaningless place. Indeed, people have frequently found forests to be places of great insight. If you're a fan of Thoreau, you'll know these kind of comments he makes. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what I had to teach. And there's a kind of asceticism in this worldview, which is appealing. However, the wood itself is not rational. Pines grow chaotically in patterns that are only discerned with difficulty and are then found to be probabilistic. But to put it another way, there is a chilling impersonality, and that's Weinberg's phrase about the forest. Any meaning must come from the human individual themselves, and hence Weinberg writes, the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it seems pointless. He next qualified the comment by saying, we ourselves can invent a point for our lives, trying to understand the universe would be one such activity. So in arboreal terms, that means we must make clearings in the woods, where we can stretch our intellectual legs and make ourselves at home. Clearings also provide a base camp for which to explore, a kind of imaginative base camp, you might say. And I rather like this phrase of James Murray, one of the original editors of the Oxford English Dictionary, who said, I feel that in many ways I and my assistants are simply pioneers, pushing our way experimentally through untrodden forest, where no axe has been before. And there's something of this sense of here we are on our kind of tiny clearing in the midst of the forest of the universe, and we're, as it were, trying to put our axe to a few nearby trees in order to discover something of what lies in the depth of beyond. So, is the atheistic Godwin forest a good place to settle the meaning of physics? Well, Weinberg thinks so, of course. He argues that there's a kind of trend in science that gradually comes to explain everything, or at least everything that's worth asking about. So, in Dreams of the Final Theory, he writes, in this century we've seen a convergence of the arrows of explanation, like the convergence of meridians towards the North Pole. Our deepest principles, although not yet final, have become steadily more simple and economical. Again, you notice that ascetic appeal of Godwin Forest, the simplicity in the economy. He's particularly suspicious of speculation that takes him beyond what he knows in the world around him. Such speculation, he thinks, leaves science and enters the realm of superstition. Again, as he himself puts it, perhaps there is a final theory, a set of principles from which flow all arrows of explanation, but he changed his mind about this. He now says we shall never learn what it is. For instance, it may be that humans are simply not intelligent enough to discover or to understand the final theory. Now, this commitment to materialism is, of course, a great strength. It roots knowledge in what can be empirically proven. However, there is perhaps a certain loss of wonder in this view of things, and it's a view of life that I think does tend to unweave the rainbow, to recall Keats's line. But again, that's just a lesson from history, which Weinberg himself acknowledges. Throughout most of human history, he says, our maps of the earth have shown great unknown spaces that the imagination can fill with dragons and golden cities and anthropophagi. But today, every acre of the Earth's land surface has been mapped and the dragons are all gone. With the discovery of the final laws, our daydreams will again contract. For some, such a view of the universe is satisfying enough, perhaps the aesthetic imagination particularly. For others, though, it's not. So let us leave the forest and travel to the landscape of a worldview that's related, I think, philosophically, but looks very different, and that is the Mystery Fens. Now, the Mystery Fens are not unlike the Godwin forest. In fact, studies of the bogs show that it once was a forest. We're probably sat sort of on a forest right now. The peat formed at the end of the last ice age when the forest was flooded and the trees died. Similarly, the Mystery Fens is related somewhat to the worldview of the forest. It is essentially materialist. The difference is that when the trees fell down, the sky could no longer be ignored, though more often than not, it is concealed by a cloud, as we can see today. Inhabitants of the fens are therefore open to the language of transcendence. Sometimes they do see the blue sky. However, they prefer to stay rooted in the terra firma of empirical science. Now, the physicist who I imagine inhabiting a world a bit like this is Martin Rees, Master of Trinity, and the man who is an atheist but goes to Evensong in Trinity College Chapel. So kind of open to the transcendent, but prefers to say rooted in empirical science. But there is an earthy kind of humility to his writing, I think. He's highly conscious of the millennia that stretch ahead of us as human beings, disaster notwithstanding, which he's written about too. But given that humankind has only had about 8,000 years of intellectual history to its credit, and that we only know a tiny patch of the possible universe, this should, he thinks, instill certain attitudes. One is a modesty about our achievements. And second is a consciousness of the possibility that our minds may ultimately not be up to grasping much of meaning and reality. Ours could be the lot of the creature who knows mostly what it doesn't know. Inhabitants of the mystery fens might like this kind of aphorism from Montaigne, who wrote, "Man is quite insane. He wouldn't know how to create a maggot, and yet he creates gods by the dozen." So you notice the similarity between the Reesian view and the Weinbergian view. However, there is a difference, I think. For Rees, it's much quicker to reach for the word mystery. In fact, in his writings, it feels to me it's never far from his lips. Now, he means mystery in a natural sense, rather than a supernatural sense. Basically, what he means is that science can articulate questions and attempt to find answers, though the answers may not be forthcoming, and may even lead to deeper questions which seem even more unanswerable. After all, why should the universe be transparent to our probing and not rather a mystery to us? And that we can understand anything is, in a way, a bit of a mystery already. But it's a natural mystery, a mystery within natural science, not outside of natural science. So the recent way of discerning the mystery is that of the scientist, to find theories and to test for empirical evidence. Indirect evidence, perhaps, but evidence nonetheless. Thus, says Rees, he has no strong opinions about the role that, say, consciousness may play in the collapse of the wave function of quantum physics. Time will tell, or not. Time, in a way, is a big test for him. Don't run ahead of things right now. That said, it's for similar reasons that he's not inclined to religious belief, but he doesn't want to attack it at the same time. So in his book, Before the Beginning, he writes, "Scientists' incursions into theology or philosophy can be embarrassingly naive or dogmatic. The implications for cosmology for these realms of thought may be profound, but diffidence prevents me from venturing into them." It's perhaps the case that metaphysical speculation just can't be part of his makeup. It's not, as it were, part of his psychological imagination, you might say. And he's talked about how the hydrogen atom, the simplest structure in the universe, is hard enough to understand. Sort of explaining Montaigne, he says, why on earth would we go for such wild speculation, therefore, as the theological to him? This is perhaps reflected in cosmologist Joseph Silk when he agreed that humility in the face of persistent great unknowns is the true philosophy that modern physics has to offer. And when I asked Martin Rees, he did confess that he reads philosophy and theology sometimes, but I suspected that it was mostly just to kind of clarify scientific questions when he was asked them by probing journalists like myself. In fact, I think he probably believes religion has nothing to offer science, and would affirm Stephen Jay Gould's notion of a non-overlapping magisteria, perhaps with the slightly tinged ramifications for that Michael Roos was pointing out to us last night, and added that traditional theology seems parochial to him compared with vastness of space and time. And I think it would be fair to say perhaps that Rees' view of a theological is that it's dangerous because it can easily lead you astray. And just recently, I spent a whole weekend watching The Lord of the Rings on DVD once again. And it reminded me a bit of the Dead Marshes, where when Sam and Frodo walk through being led by Gollum. And if you remember, they're a bit like the Mystery Fens. They're wetlands fed by streams and rivers and so on. But as you look into the waters, strange faces stare back at you. And it's easy to be kind of inhabited in your mind by these ghouls and ghosts and get drawn into the mists and the vapours. And I suspect that Martin Rees thinks that theology is a bit like that. If you stare too hard, as it were, into the mists of mystery, then all sorts of faces start staring back at you. But they're really not to be trusted. They're dangerous. Now, that said, there is some hope, because there is the future ahead of us. Only 8,000 years of intellectual history to our credit so far, and maybe many millennia ahead of us. Clearly, we won't need to live to see it, but there's some kind of sort of hope in that, perhaps sort of proleptic hope, you might say. But the big thing is that it's a humility that's required, and preparedness to embrace the radical uncertainty that comes with this particular kind of natural mystery. Now, this can feel rather empty, though I think perhaps it is perhaps the default position of many physicists, at least officially. They stand in awe of the universe and know that understanding comes slowly. However, there is hope, and that offers a path to the next landscape on our journey. Some physicists believe there's reason to think that physics already occupies a kind of higher place, you might say, a different kind of landscape. And so this takes us to the Platonic heights. Now, to catch a glimpse of the alpine landscape of the Northern Lights is to ask yourself a question I think all physicists whisper to themselves from time to time. Whether or not they're prepared to speculate in print is another question entirely. It takes a brave physicist to do so. But one such person was Eugene Wigner, who in 1960 wrote this essay with the famous title, "The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences." The title, in a way, sort of says it all. Wigner begins with a sense shared by all the physicists with whom I've spoken, actually, off the record, that mathematics is not created, but it's discovered. And in this essay, Wigner is prepared to ponder what that might mean, and in particular the meaning that might be drawn from the fact that human beings can discover laws of nature, and that nature appears to obey mathematical laws. It seems like a miracle. And Wigner writes, "It is a miracle that in spite of the baffling complexity of the world, certain regularities in the events could be discovered. It is hard to believe that our reasoning power was brought by Darwin's process of natural selection to the perfection which it seems to possess, at least the perfection found in mathematics." Now this perfection is beyond understanding. Physicists therefore feel very differently about what it means, and this is private and public difference sometimes you can discover too. This is the reason, in a way, why they occupy different landscapes, why they have a different, more imagination. And the place that they pitch their tents, as it were, in a way turns on what this beyond understanding might mean in the unreasonable effects of mathematics and the natural scientists. But for some, it does signify a mystery within the natural world, and I guess this is where people like Martin Rees would lie. But might it be possible to go further? For whilst it's entirely possible that we may never grasp why mathematics is so effective, and we can say something about its effectiveness, namely that it is routinely described by qualities like order, beauty, and wisdom. The notion that mathematics is ordered and beautiful is perhaps relatively familiar to an audience such as this, but maybe just touch a bit more on this idea that it's wise. Now, just a very quick example of this, which I guess is well known to people too, but you remember the case of Einstein, who found that his equations of general relativity implied things about the universe which he just couldn't believe. And so he added this famous cosmological constant to try and cancel out the effect. Later though, particularly one of these features, the expansion of the universe, came to be proven with Hubble's work. And then this famously led Einstein to calling the cosmological constant the biggest blunder of my life. But then there's another twist to the tale, because it turns out the cosmological constant did in fact have a meaning, and it stands for what's now known as the vacuum energy. And all in all, you could say that the equations that Einstein discovered were wiser even than he was. So this is some nature of the sort of mystery of mathematics, that it seems to be wiser even than we are. And perhaps that's why physicists seem to move back to this default position that they discover mathematics rather than create it. The implication is that without understanding why and how mathematics works, we might be justified in concluding that qualities like order, beauty, and wisdom are written through the fabric of the universe. Moreover, if mathematics is discovered, perhaps to do mathematics is to discover these things as well. Could that not be a profound source of meaning? Might it even say something about the existence of transcendence? These aesthetic, epistemological, and even moral aspects do indeed lead theists to call on mathematics as evidence for the existence of God. Or perhaps, to put it in a more nuanced way, they say that the power of mathematics is exactly the kind of thing you would expect in a universe created by an ordered, beautiful, and wise deity. And so the philosopher Leibniz famously puts it this way: when God calculates and thinks things through, the world is made. For the theist, the belief is that human beings can apprehend God's thinking through, partly by doing science. And the physicist and priest, Michael Heller, puts it in his book like this, in his book, The Comprehensible Universe. In the human brain, the world structure has reached its focal point. The structure of the world has acquired the ability to reflect upon itself. In this conceptual setting, science appears as a collective effort of the human mind to reach the mind of God. The mind of man and the mind of God are strangely interwoven, he writes. And I think there is something profound in this use of the metaphor, the mind of God. You might reflect on some more mathematics. Big subject. Forgive my very cursory touching on it, but you can ask questions like, would 1 + 1 equal to always and everywhere? And perhaps even if the universe didn't exist, it does seem to have a priori and necessary nature. Or alternatively, you can ask about where the laws of nature come from, or the meta-laws that describe the laws of nature, or maybe a kind of transcendent explanation, the orthogonal line that I was just talking about last night, might be a better way, perhaps not an explanation, but at least a way of holding this mystery. But of course, it is a big leap to go from the metaphysics of mathematics to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. For one reason, mathematics is not personal, and no one would suggest you worship mathematics, although it may inspire awe. At best, mathematics could be taken as sort of circumstantial evidence for the God of perhaps a deist. But there's another way of explaining the unreasonable effect of mathematics too, and that takes us back to Platonic heights. Now, the point about Platonic heights is not that just they're beautiful and permanent, a bit like mathematics, and it's that they seem to take us to another world, where things perhaps are a bit clearer. Alexander Pope put it like this: hills peep over hills and Alps on Alps arise. And the Victorian agnostic and mountaineer Leslie Stephen described it in this way: the qualities which strike every sensitive observer are impressed upon the mountaineer with tenfold force and intensity. He has learnt a language which is but partially revealed to ordinary men. The mountain's voice is mystic and has found discordant interpreters, but to me, at least, it speaks in tones at once more tender and more awe-inspiring than that of any mortal teacher. Now, philosophically speaking, we're here in the world of the forms of Plato, pondered by Plato. In relation to mathematics, there's the notion that mathematical forms exist in some independent, non-physical world, where things, as it were, are a bit more rarefied, a bit more clear. There's blues and whites and not many reds and oranges, you might say. And the physicist who lives here quite explicitly is Roger Penrose. He represents the relationship between the mathematical world, the natural world, and our mental world with diagrams like this. I hope you can see that in the bottom right-hand corner. And for those wary of God's talk, the Platonic option represents an alternative that might appeal. It recognises that mathematics appears to have an existence that is not dependent upon human thought, but without committing you to a full-blown theological cosmology. You can appeal to things like Gödel's incompleteness theorem, if you can understand it. But Gödel himself was a signed-up Platonist, so presumably he understood his own theorem, and that's where it led him. There's an intuitive truth, you might say, not just sort of empirical truth. And the conclusion would be that mathematics is not just some kind of model of the physical world. When it encapsulates fundamental laws, it has what philosophers would call a realist relation with those laws. Now, that said, Platonism is hardly a conclusive answer to the effectiveness of mathematics. On the one hand, it raises all sorts of problems about how the Platonic world interacts with the natural world. The problems represented by the arrows and funnels in Penrose's diagram. Of course, if you have read Plato, you know that Plato was more than aware of all these problems himself. On the other hand, for Plato, the Platonic possibility did not stop with abstractions like mathematics. It embraced higher moral qualities too. It appealed to his imagination. It wasn't just that E equals mc squared, if you like, but there was something going on that led him at least to ponder and speculate about the possibility of the good itself. And here's how he describes it in the Symposium. It's a nature of wondrous beauty, a nature which in the first place is everlasting, not growing and decaying, or waxing and waning. Secondly, beauty absolute, separate, simple and everlasting, which without diminution, without increase, or any change, is imparted to the ever-growing and perishing beauty of all other things. Now this leads Plato to wonder whether the good is the same as the divine. He argues very conclusively, I think, that this is never something that can be settled by mere mortals, who are in-between creatures. But it does seem as if sometimes we get these glimpses of eternity, and well, geometry for him more than mathematics, was apparently the way to go. Now, Penrose doesn't go this way. His preferred view is to say that the Platonic nature of mathematics is a mystery, but that it doesn't actually say much about the existence of God at all. After all, 1 plus 1 equals 2, not because some God says so, but because it does. As it were, God has nothing to do with it. So Penrose concludes, I don't take that view, that God created the universe. I'm not going to argue against that view, so he's not particularly worried about theism. I'm not going to take a religious view in this at all. I would say it's neutral with respect to the existence of God. So he's not a militant atheist. In fact, he's quite happy to talk of his Platonic view of mathematics as God-given in his books. But for him, it's just a sort of provocative metaphor. To put it another way, what you make of mathematics is probably a question of faith or lack of it. And I don't just mean religious faith, because it seems to me that every physicist, every scientist probably, has to stake his or her life on this effectiveness of mathematics question. Why is it so effective? That can't be answered, but you trust that it is. The point is that for all positions, there's a point at which they bump up against something they can't explain. Why there are laws, why mathematics works, why we can discover much about the universe at all. But, is that right? Is there not another possibility that might account for things in a really very different way? And this takes us away from the Platonic heights through to our fourth landscape, which is the hills of awareness. Now, I imagine the hills of awareness a bit like these limestone mountains in Guilin in South China, which are also represented in traditional Chinese art. Now, the thing about this art is that there's plenty of play for the interplay between nature and emotion. They're both, as it were, imaginative drawings as well as drawings of the landscape. The aim of the artist is to convey something of the nature of nature in the image, and then to suggest what Taoists call the Tao. And the Tao cannot be defined, but it might be hinted at by the expression, the nature of nature, that which lies behind everything. The paintings work, I think, by inviting you to wander in your imagination through the elements of nature that they represent. And I do wonder whether a lot of popular science writing is inviting you on a kind of similar journey to wander through these mountains, as it were, through the clouds and through the mists, and to try and discern perhaps something which the Taoists might call the Tao. You'll notice too that there's no horizon in these images. The fact that they're painted they're often painted in portrait, in fact, rather than landscape, because the horizon doesn't matter at all. It just occurred to me actually that we tend to view everything in landscape because we assume that there's a horizon over which we should be trying to peer. Even PowerPoint is presented in landscape, whereas in the Chinese way of things, the portrait, which doesn't really worry so much about the horizon because things are imminent, that would be the point. And instead, these images hang right in front of you in valleys and gullies. And you stare into the clouds of unknowing which are in front of you, as it were, not at some distant point. You don't look up, you look ahead. This element of composition represents the idea that enlightenment is not to be found elsewhere, in some transcendent realm, but is to be found here and now, imminently. And it's this sense, I think, that resonates with the theory of meaning which the inhabitants of the hills of awareness put forward. And here I'm thinking particularly of Paul Davies. You may well have read some of his books. And I think that he's a very even-handed kind of writer, but I think he's pulled perhaps in a direction a bit like this. And you see this, I think, particularly in his discussion of notions of emergence. The hills are so called because for Davies, the existence of self-consciousness in the cosmos is a pressing question for our time. It's the one that makes it possible to talk about the meaningfulness of physics for him. In a phenomenon he has risen within the universe, you might say, namely humanity, that can observe the universe and attempts to understand itself and the universe. Moreover, that structure has a self-conscious purpose. This leads Davies to the following observation in his book, The Goldilocks Enigma, Why is the Universe Just Right for Life? It seems to me that there is a genuine scheme of things. The universe is about something. Similarly, the playwright Michael Frayn has written this enigma in his reflection on the meaning of physics, his book The Human Touch, when he said, "So we are perhaps not after all such nobodies, we're not for nothing." And even more radically, Eugene Wigner, who was very prepared to speculate on these things, he talks about how the very study of the external world led to the conclusion that the content of consciousness is an ultimate reality. So consciousness, as it were, plays as much a part of the universe as anything else. Now Davies takes this tries to explore this link between consciousness and science, and he says that these are very early days. He's very clear about that. This is no settled view, but he begins to push it, if you like. He takes it in this way. Very roughly, he argues that at the quantum level, he believes mathematics can be interpreted as lumpy. He's moving away from the Platonic view, this idea that mathematics is discovered. And he begins to do this by saying that mathematics is lumpy. And this suggests that the laws of nature do not exist in some Platonic realm, but are part of the contingent fabric of the universe. And this is how he puts it. The universe on a mega scale could resemble a cosmic United States of America, with different shaped states separated by sharp boundaries. What we have hitherto taken to be a universal law of physics would be more akin to local bylaws or state laws rather than national or federal laws. He speculates that observers are required to settle which laws exist in any particular part of the universe. So as it were, we decide what laws we're going to follow in some kind of democratic process in politics, but maybe by some sort of observational process, you might say, in physics. In short, the existence of the universe, the laws of nature and conscious observers are interconnected. They merge together. So how can we make some sense of this at this more imaginative, intuitive level? I think it can be done perhaps by relating it to these Chinese-style hills of awareness. Again, there's no transcendent horizon in this landscape over which physicists might strive to peer. Neither is there any need to resort to a deity, since the mystery of the nature of nature is immanent. Rather, nature emerges from behind the clouds and mists as they shift and dissolve. Now, there's a Buddhist astronomer who's written rather nicely about this. I'm afraid I have no idea how to pronounce his name, but Trin Huan Fran, perhaps you can see it at the bottom there. But he writes very well about it, and he said that one current idea is that the elementary particles in the primordial terrestrial soup manage to organise themselves into ever more complex states in a process called emergence, until they produce the building blocks of life that were capable of reproducing themselves and finally life itself. This form of organisation doesn't require outside intervention or mysterious forces, rather order emerges as soon as the complexity reaches a critical threshold. And he has some dialogues with the Buddhist scholar Mathieu Ricard, who has a background in science as well, and they came up with this thought, that consciousness fashions reality and reality fashions consciousness like the blades of two knives sharpening each other. A proper understanding of the interdependence thus implies transcending the conventional notions of levels of existence or of dualism between self and the world, or between consciousness and inanimate. So you see an attempt here to try and bridge the thing which I mentioned at the beginning between the subjective and the objective, evidence and experience, and so on, consciousness and the inanimate world. I think there's much appeal in this view of things, in fact. It's quite an attractive landscape. On the other hand, there are, of course, big questions to ask about it, not least to do with how the universe might come to understand itself and about the role of consciousness in physics. And there is another way to respond to this speculation based upon a different kind of middle way, not the middle way of the Buddhist view of things, but the middle way that's known as Anglicanism. And this takes us to our Newton Wold. It's here that I see John Polkinghorne living. The Wold, of course, refers to Weald, and the Church of England own Weald land, which is populated by churches a bit like this. And John Polkinghorne is quite clear that he finds contemporary physics remarkably resonant with Christian belief. During his career, he has also seen that many who are interested in fundamental physics and beginning and end of things in cosmology also become really quite interested in the big questions like God. However, whilst both science and religion are looking for truth, his big point really is that they're different. The wise scholar is therefore someone who does not confuse the two, who seeks a middle way. And Francis Bacon, another great Englishman you might say, put it this way: they do not wisely mingle or confound these learnings together. Polkinghorne calls them intellectual cousins. The Big Bang is not the same as the doctrine of creation out of nothing, though there are perhaps connections, but they'll be imaginative, inspirational ones, not empirical, scientific ones. Alternatively, religion, unlike science, is transpersonal. Thus, Polkinghorne confesses he meets God primarily in religious practice and not in mathematical questions. Science only gives a thin notion of God, he argues. On reading too much into physics, he warns against reading too much into physics, such as equating the singularity of the Big Bang with God. Similarly, looking at quantum mechanics and deriving, say, an ethic of relationship or a basis for telepathy, which has been done from the phenomenon of quantum entanglement, he thinks would be going way too far. Physics, as it were, is showing us a world that's most more subtle, that you need to be careful. So he also wants to say, as well as don't read too much into physics, he also argues don't read too little from the physics. There's, as it were, some way you can go. You have to try and get the right balance and the right middle way. Hence notions such as the multiverse, which he thinks is to run away from what proper physics tells us, is an example of that. It seems like a desperate measure to him, as it were, to put at bay any kind of theistic resonance with what physics might be telling us. And this approach is also well explored by a book by Hans Kuhn, The Beginning of All Things, Science and Religion, where he talks about a kind of scientific political correctness and it's an instinctive opposition that he senses, so that any kind of scientific explanation, no matter how wild, is preferable to anyone that smacks of religion. Now, the key to finding the way we live in the world is to realise that science has its limits and that religion is able to go further. To find meaning in life, you must leave the Godwin forest, risk speculating about what lies through the clouds that cover the mystery fens, and be prepared to wager more than perhaps a Platonic faith alone would allow. John Popham writes, if you want to pursue the search for understanding through and through, a quest that is most natural for us to embark upon, he argues, we will have to be prepared to go beyond the limits of science itself in the search for the wildest and deepest context, the widest, not wildest, the widest and deepest context of intelligibility. I think that this further quest, if openly pursued, will take the inquiry in the direction of religious belief. So you get some sense of how he sees science and religion relating. It's a fair comment. But one of the things that strikes me, and this is what kind of keeps me in the agnostic frame rather than the Christian frame, is that I wonder whether science might take us beyond the limits of Christianity. It seems that it might cut both ways. For example, when we were in the Mystery Fens, thinking about Martin Rees, and he talked about 8,000 years of intellectual history and what might lie in the future. And it does seem to me to be quite a problem for Christianity that will Jesus Christ be so central to relatives, say, in 10,000 years from now, the so-called scandal of particularity. Theologians have thought about all these questions before, by the way. They're not new, but it is still a pressing question. Alternatively, if consciousness evolves as the cosmos evolves, consciousness evolves as the cosmos evolves, then it would seem reasonable to assume that the insights represented by the Christian revelation would be superseded in time, perhaps in much the same way that astronomy was succeeded by Newton, who was succeeded by quantum mechanics. In fact, there are signs that religious convictions, or at least notions about spirituality, are changing already, and partly, as it were, as a result of the new physics. And this is one of the things which gives me a sense that whilst we're in the midst of it, and we'll certainly never know the end of it, we are perhaps in a time of religious change. And this evolution takes us to the last landscape on the map for the meaning of physics, and it's to the California cliff tops. Hold on, for those of you who are at least prepared to do speculation. In his book, Fritjof Capler, in the book The Tao of Physics, Fritjof Capler presents one of the most sort of popular versions of this kind of approach to science and religion. And he describes sitting by the ocean one late summer afternoon, watching the waves rolling in and feeling the rhythm of my breathing, when I suddenly became aware my whole environment has been engaged in a gigantic cosmic dance. In his book, Capra develops the idea that the language of physics has come up against the limitations of language when describing reality. But this has been long recognised by the mystical traditions, and particularly for him, the Eastern mystical traditions. Just as it is impossible to say what a photon is, only that sometimes it's a particle, sometimes it looks like a wave, so the mystics understand that truly seeing reality is beyond human words and must in some way be intuitive, glimpsed, if you like, through in processes often referred to as enlightenment. He believes that science has developed a new way of probing reality that complements the older way of probing reality developed by the mystics. So he says physicists explore levels of matter, mystics levels of mind. What the explorations have in common is that these levels, in both cases, lie beyond ordinary sense perception. And as Heisenberg has taught us, if the perception is non-ordinary, then the reality is not ordinary. Capra's ideas were and are very influential, especially when coupled to other figures who have sought to fuse science and religion, thinking of people like Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, and perhaps more recently Matthew Fox, who actually is in London next week if you want to go here and talk. Gives you some indication of what I'm doing next week. Teilhard de Chardin has written, the history of the living world can be summarised, the living world can be summarised as the elaboration of ever more perfect eyes within a cosmos in which there is always something more to be seen. So you notice the idea, the links here perhaps between emergence and the evolution of consciousness too. Surprisingly, perhaps, even overtly atheistic books inspire some of those who live on the California coast. And I happen to know a chap called Dr Mark Vernon, and he told me that when he read A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking, it led to, as it were, a sense of all this. He said, I read that book and I think I understood less than 20% of it, but I found myself just totally enthralled by the book, and I cannot rationally explain what that was about. I've met at least 5,000 people in my travels and workshops who had exactly the same experience. Perhaps one reason why these books sell. In its latest guise, the vision of physics that the inhabitants of California coast find compelling is called the universe story. And this is really a very big movement, actually. It began with my final physicist, the book written by Brian Swim in conjunction with Thomas Berry. And what it does, it tells a scientific story of the universe, from the Big Bang to the emergence of human consciousness, and does via a new sacred myth. The desire is very much to try and describe a new sacred myth based on the stories of science. And so Brian Swim writes, the universe is attempting to be felt, and appreciating this insight, he believes, leads to an experience of the newness, which Swim defines as being shocked by the splendour of existence. The universe story, this movement called the universe story, it commands an increasingly large following and manifests what Gordon Lynch, the sociologist of religion in Kent, at the University of Kent at Canterbury, has called progressive spirituality. The progressive element refers to the ethics that seems to follow from this, and in particular, it inspires an ecological ethics, a kind of ecological awareness. They explain that this springs directly from what the new physics tells us about our place in the universe, that being defined by our relationality. We're literally linked to the stars that we're made from, the stardust of which we're made. They then do this further speculation, talking about the entanglement of quantum particles and so on. We're creatures with all sorts of possible tomorrows, like the non-determined states of quantum mechanics. The difference is that we must take responsibility for these tomorrows, since we have emerged into self-consciousness. This is what self-consciousness delivers. It delivers a kind of responsibility for the further evolution. Now, research does show that this movement is growing. Actually, I just received in the last 12 months 2 new books developing the universe story, and the Terry lectures last couple of years ago were given by 2 proponents of the universe story. It's particularly apparently prevalent in Roman Catholic religious communities, particularly women's communities, that the Vatican pays no attention to. They develop these ecological sort of new myths. And of course it's very big too in what's sometimes called the New Age, and magazines such as this one, What is Enlightenment, routinely appeal to this kind of universe story. Now it's perhaps tempting to write it off, as it were, as... I need this. Yeah. It's perhaps tempting to write it off as just the New Age. And indeed, when I spoke to Paul Davies about this, because his books are widely read by these kind of groups too, he was very nervous about it, although he writes a lot about emergence. He said there's a lot of flaky stuff in this area, where people present quantum physics in a mystical light and then draw all sorts of dubious spiritual conclusions. And he said, I'm reluctant to get involved because the field is so vague. Fair enough. But I also suspect that there's more sophistication than sometimes is given credit to these views. For example, it's sometimes said that it's just tied to trendy physics. But Capra had already thought about this, in fact. He said many concepts we hold today will be replaced by a different set of concepts tomorrow. But this replacement will occur in an orderly way, and the basic themes that I use in my comparison with mystical traditions, he believes, will be enforced rather than invalidated. Further, it's part and parcel of the universe story that we're only beginning to understand our connection with the cosmos, as scientists are only beginning to understand the nature of the universe. So we should positively expect things to change and develop. A deeper criticism, I think, of inhabitants of the California coast are that they're somewhat picky about the science that they appeal to. So, for example, they're very happy to appeal to quantum connectedness, but they're not very happy to appeal to quantum destructiveness and what that might mean for their ecological ethics. They use a kind of a la carte approach to science, I think. And this is what Dermot said to me. We need to let go of our power and of our dominance and the anthropic principle, which he particularly doesn't like. There's an attempt to put the human at the centre rather than the creation at the centre. So there's kind of anti-humanism in this view that's provoked when the notion of cosmic emergence is suggested to imply that human consciousness exists at the top of a hierarchy of being. So that's just some reasons why you might want to critique the California coast. But perhaps the reason why I have a secret admiration for it is because I do think that they're attempting to bring these worlds together, that Fritjof Capra's courageousness, if you like, was to take this experience he had, this mystical experience he had, and try to relate it to his physics. And for me that deserves quite a lot of respect, in fact. He didn't just park it as a private experience and told his wife and no one else, and he tried to make something of it. So this concludes our tour of the map of the meaning of physics. We began in Godwin Forest with the materialist view of things, the aesthetic view, you might say, which has a certain appeal to a certain kind of imagination, I think. We moved to the mystery fens that can see the sky, but it's often cloudy. So there's a kind of respect for the transcendent, as it were, a love of art and music, you might say, but doesn't really want to go there. The Platonic heights, with Roger Penrose, who's the physicist who's written most explicitly about his Platonic views, particularly via the unreasonable effective of mathematics, and taking that seriously. Again, it feels quite a dry, abstract sort of place, and doesn't really lead to much religiosity, I think. And of course, Plato had to do a lot more work on things like love in order to really derive something that had human feeling from his philosophy. We move then to the hills of awareness, where Paul Davies, I think, is going, and these ideas that immanence and emergence, and maybe appealing to some of the Eastern ideas that are becoming more current in the West. We went then to the Cleveland world, which was a different kind of middle way. The idea is that we have binocular vision, we human beings, and one eye sees the world through science, one eye sees the world through religious traditions, particularly in John Polkinghorne's view, and binocular vision gives us depth in the world, so we need both sides. And then finally ended up on the California coast. A very substantial movement, I think, and particularly this notion of the universe story. Now, I am an agnostic, so I just wanted to add a few concluding comments. I'm not at all sure what time it is, but I guess I'm doing all right. Yeah. The first sort of agnostic kind of virtue, which of course not just agnostics have, but many people can have, but the first agnostic virtue might be that of caution. And I think one of the ways that you can help deepen this sense of caution is with a historic awareness. So it's important that we think about the history of these things as well later on in the conference. This was drawn to my attention when I went to a seminar given by Timothy Jenkins here in Cambridge. And he remarked that when Newton's discoveries first became popular, which was the new physics of his day, they didn't just offer it to many people a theory of gravitation, action at a distance, but they seem to justify astrology too, which after all is not appealing to action at a distance too. Tim Jenkins said, if it is the case that planets exert specific gravitational forces upon other bodies at a distance, it is reasonable to suppose that the relative position of the various planets at the time of a person's conception of birth may influence the person's life chance and possibilities, and that the influence of the planets may continue to act day by day. And it didn't just stop there, actually. Newtonianism led to all sorts of developments, such as mesmerism, spiritualism, phrenology, and vegetarianism. It's been linked with all sorts of things. And the point is that none of these are completely arbitrary. They do exploit real ambiguities and apparent implications of the theory. They're not just ridiculous. The other point, of course, is that in the modern period, science comes to carry this great prestige. As Pope put it, nature and nature's laws lay hidden in night. God said, let Newton be, and all was light. There's great prestige that comes with being able to associate your metaphysics, your speculation, with science quite clearly. And the other thing that's interesting about Tim Jenkins' observations is that he wasn't actually talking about the New Age. This was in the seminar critiquing the New Atheists, and in particular the God Delusion. And one of the reasons why he thinks it's not actually a very good book is because Richard Dawkins there does a similar thing to what happened with Newton and astrology, only this time it's with evolution. And as it were, in the same way that Newtonism was applied willy-nilly to all parts of life, so the argument is that evolution has gone the same way, that it's applied as if it can explain absolutely everything. And what's been lost here is a sense of caution and awareness of the limitations of science too. Certainly the argument would be that this is poor science as much as using a theory of gravity to explain astrology would be. So caution is the first concluding thought. The other thought is to advocate some philosophy and to be able to make links, as it were, be able to risk speculation, but to try to, at the same time, to justify your speculation. And I take courage from this, that in fact the first geniuses of the new physics were also actually, philosophical aficionados, Schrödinger, Heisenberg and the like. And they really were very sophisticated thinkers, as well as being good at science, and I suspect the two things were linked. However, during the second half of the 20th century, there's been a kind of loss of confidence in philosophy, particularly I think in the Anglo-American scientific world. And there's a tendency, I think, for philosophers to think they have to kind of, as it were, follow the science, to offer apologies for their philosophy. And I think this is a bit of a shame, that there's a kind of philosophical boldness that's there when you read Heisenberg and Schrödinger that perhaps could be recovered. I particularly, for example, like Heisenberg's very powerful critique of materialism. In his book Physics and Philosophy, he observes that history can be divided into periods according to what people of the time make of matter. And he believes that at the beginning of the 20th century, we entered a new period. It's then that quantum physics threw off materialism that had dominated natural science up to that point. And so he writes, materialism is a frame so narrow and rigid that it's difficult to find a place for it. For many concepts of our language, that it always belongs to its very substance. For example, the concept of mind, of the human soul, or of life. Mind could be introduced into the general picture only as a kind of mirror of the material world. Now, today we live in the 21st century, and he was hoping that this materialism would be long gone by now, but of course it sticks, this narrow and rigid view of things, as he puts it. But his advice is to hold on, as it were, to your experience whilst taking note of the science. And there's a reason why words like mind and soul won't quite die, because they do seem to touch a very profound sense of what it is to be human, which the mechanistic view of things just can't really encompass. And Heisenberg's advice certainly is to take that very seriously. It's not just to think it's an epiphenomenon or a delusion or something like that. The third point and the final point, though, is a sort of capacity to live with uncertainty. And again, I think this is perhaps something which tends to be lost in the present age anyway. This, I think, links back to the point about I hope will be a beginnings of a recovery of apophatic theology, the negative way, a capacity to have this negative capability, as it's sometimes put. The general point is that modern physics is deepening, but it's also disorientating, and the two go hand in hand. And if you don't have much of a tolerance for doubt and for this disorientation, then it's very tempting to reach for certainties, to rush, as it were, to conclusions. But if you can accept scientific knowledge particularly as deepening, not dissolving mystery, then perhaps this helps. There are, of course, two different kinds of mystery you can appeal to. There's the kind of mysteries which will one day be solved, perhaps, or if not, they'll just be ever beyond us. The kind of empty mystery, you might say. But then there's also what we might call this fuller mystery, which is the Platonic view, and then other views that sort of follow from it. The idea that mystery actually points us to a perception of reality which we'll never completely grasp, because, as Plato puts it, we're these in-between creatures, or Augustine puts it rather more beautifully when he says that we're between the beasts and the angels. But nonetheless, it's very important for our humanity. To be human, if you like, is to be a creature for whom our own existence is sort of too small for us. We long to reach out, and this inspires both our creativity and our innovation, but it's a dangerous force because it can also lead to the desire for certainty and even the desire to destroy that which pushes us too much in this uncertain direction. I think that in a way we have to learn what I think is a great insight of Socrates, and the reason why this chap is remembered, that we're not just ignorant. To be just ignorant is actually perhaps to be fine. But we have to develop a kind of wise ignorance, an ability to live, to be conscious of our ignorance, to know that we don't know as much as to enjoy that which we do know. And the skeptics of the ancient world talked about being human as living on the edge of a circle. Inside the circle is what we know, but the bigger the circle gets, the more there is that lies outside the circle, the unknown. And the richness of human life, as it were, is to be able to straddle both worlds, to be able to embody this virtue of uncertainty, you might say. So there are my final thoughts. The caution, the capacity to speculate, but also a kind of tolerance for doubt as well. Thanks very much.
That's tremendous. Really great overview, and I really like your classification there, so thank you. Over to you for questions.
Really enjoyed the talk. Just wanted to have a comment and then a question. The California Coast, that whole sort of cosmic philosophy approach has a lot of 19th century antecedents that come out of thinkers like Herbert Spencer, who's got this sort of cosmic evolution approach. And even there are people like Robert Chambers in his Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation also has this kind of cosmic story. So it's not the physicists who put it forward first, it's the mid-19th century evolutionists. But the question I have is about the conclusions you draw at the end of your paper. Perhaps some of the points at the very, very end are sort of connected to what I'm going to say, but it seems to me that the overall conclusion one could draw from looking at the map that you painted and so vividly illustrated for us is that the right metaphor we should use to talk about where we are now is the Tower of Babel. Because we've got 6 different systems that are coming out of modern physics, which have some commonality with each other, but really go in very different directions. I mean, you have to travel from place to place. It depends on, and the universe looks very different depending on where you're looking from which one of those 6 positions. And so I'm wondering, how do we make sense of this? It seems to me that all this tells us is that physics is in confusion about the metaphysical implications of its science, and therefore we're in confusion.
I think you're right. I mean, the way that's another way of putting the capacity to cope with uncertainty and to appreciate the times in which we live, which I think are these kind of, if we're in between creatures, maybe we always live in between times, but we're living in sort of in between times too. And I take the point about the Tower of Babel for sure. I think one of the things that perhaps is required though is and that may help at least produce some kind of clearing in the clouds, at least from time to time, is taking our experience more seriously, in our inner experience more seriously. This is, I think we live in an age where that which is objective holds sway, and that which is subjective always struggles against that. But I feel that, and this is partly why the ecological stuff interests me, is that it is an attempt, I think, or at least part of its appeal, is to ask more personal questions about what it is to be human and to live in a physical world. And whilst there's all sorts of speculation, some more flaky than others, that comes out of that, I think it is a struggle to bridge these worlds, and that's one of the reasons why it interests me. A rather good book actually, which I just read, that takes ecology seriously and does some serious philosophy with it, is actually Roger Scruton's latest book called The Face of God, which was his Gifford Lectures of a year or so back. And there he talks explicitly about this rupture in our self-consciousness, that on the one hand we know ourselves to be objects in a world of objects, but on the other hand we look at the world from a perspective, from an eye, so that we can, as it were, describe ourselves both being as subject to laws, but also as being able to take responsibility for our lives, which is not a law-like thing to be able to do. Now, these two things are just incompatible worldviews, but they somehow have to try and come together in our personhood. And I guess that That's really the only place they can. He's very interested in the book, in the notion of the sacred, and how the sacred seems to bring together the objective and the subjective. That for all people have railed against notions of the sacred. It's one of these ideas, perhaps like mind, like the soul, that just doesn't seem to die. There clearly are still sacred places in the world, amongst secular people too, as well as amongst religious people. And he wonders what that's trying to hold together. But yeah, the Tower of Babel is a very good myth. It says something true for sure. Yeah.
Dennis has a question.
Thank you, Mark. I really enjoyed your talk on the map. It's just interesting that I know you couldn't reflect on all the beliefs of all these different physicists. One thing you did mention was the eschatological beliefs of the different physicists. And it's striking, I think, a book I'm sure you've read by Martin Rees, I think came out in 2005, called This Final Century, ? As you may remember, Martin estimates that we, humanity, have a 50-50 chance of getting through the present century if you review all the various ways in which humanity now has the opportunity to kill itself, to actually go extinct. So 50-50 is, I was thinking of your particularity, you mentioned the figure of 10,000 years hence, what will life look like? Well, according to Martin Rees, we're not going to make it. Okay, so I just wondered if you wanted to reflect at all about your range of eschatological beliefs, if you like. We have, I'm not asking you to review all 6, but it's another element, I think, isn't it? And the story that physics has for us.
Well, I guess that this is perhaps Martin Rees in quite a religious mode, actually, although it's told through science and attempts at calculating probabilities like 50-50 chance and so on. But eschatology, it seems to me, is most powerful as a comment not on the future but on the present. It seems to me that's why eschatological myths arise. And so he's commenting really on the present, and particularly actually amongst other disasters that might come our way, ecological disasters. So that's, I guess, the way that I would understand Martin Rees's book there. I think that he would know much better than I do that the idea of calculating probabilities of the future, if you're tossing a coin, 50-50 makes a lot of sense. But I remember when I did probability for my physics degree, and the first thing the guy who taught us it said was that don't be fooled, probability is mostly just a set of calculated hunches. Even though it's given a sort of 70% chance of this or something, it really means almost nothing. It's a way of talking, if you like, that's tries to be informed by what's known, but nonetheless, this was the great message of Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, and his work on probability. But the uncertainty is always with us, if you like, and we shouldn't forget that. But eschatology, I'm going off from this now, but eschatology has to comment on the present rather than some sort of prediction of the future. And so perhaps Martin Rees is indulging in sort of morality science at all times, you might say.
These 6 very different approaches is that actually we're looking for something in a place where it is not to be found, which kind of comes from one or two of the things that points that were made last night. And another point that was made last night is once you've got hold of an idea, you need to be a little bit careful how far you take metaphor. Metaphor is fantastic for generating ideas, and of course we've got an infinitude of ideas buzzing around in our brains now. But if we're going to develop them, we need to kind of step away from the metaphor. Thank you very much.
Yeah, just a comment on metaphor, because we do appeal to metaphors all the time, and as Michael Bruce said last night, metaphors can be blinkers if you run too hard with the metaphor. But the mystery of metaphor is that they work, and it's really not at all clear why they work. If you say my love is like a red, red rose, it works for some reason, and it's very hard to say why. And metaphor, I think, is a sort of a bit of a bridge between, it is a bridge between the literal and perhaps something else. Metaphor is a very serious business, in fact. It's not just a flight of fancy. There's a reason why it works, which interests me.
Hi, thanks very much for that fascinating talk, Aaron Partridge. I I just wondered if you'd got any comments on the book of recent book of Ian McGilchrist on right brain, left brain. Because it seems to me that his critique of recent Western civilization, culture, whatever, makes some sense that we're almost going to the Tower of Babel because our left brains either speak German or English or whatever, but the right brain's up to something all the time, and with imaging techniques we can put a timeline on it and sometimes find it's doing something before the left brain thinks it's doing something. The right brain's done something just before. So there's a whole, if you like, objective mystery here, which is hard science, but we've just ignored because the left brain's been shooting its mouth off all the time and going to conferences. The right brain's been going to a music concert and appreciating Beethoven and not being able to say why.
Perhaps just to say a bit about McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary, which I do think is a really important book actually, all that's worth. But because it seems to me to be one of those very rare things, a book about neuroscience that's also philosophically very sophisticated, which is hard to find. His broad idea is that it's brain naturalisation, as you were suggesting there. His broad idea is that the left hemisphere sees the world in a very different way from the right hemisphere. So whilst the left hemisphere is very good, for example, at focus, the right hemisphere loves that which comes sideways on, the unexpected, you might say. A rich consciousness requires both left and right hemispheres to be working together, and in his book he talks about Renaissance pictures, for example, where you'll have a lot of focus and detail in the foreground. If you know that the image of the old man and his grandson, there's an awful lot of details about the particular person which the left hemisphere, as it were, loves. But then you always look through a window and there's a kind of winding road up a hillside with something happening in a distant place, which the right brain loves. And these pictures have their kind of aesthetic appeal because they bring both sides together. And I think in a way, what McGilchrist is suggesting is a bit like this business I'm trying to suggest of taking one's experience seriously and trying to find some way of bringing them together. I know that Ian McGilchrist is very nervous about talking about left brain and right brain because his point is that consciousness is the whole thing and we need both. It's not like one's bad and one's good, which brain naturalisation has rather suffered from in the past. But nonetheless, we do perhaps need to be more open to the uncertainty of the right-brainedness and what that view of things, as it were, can offer us, and try and work out ways of talking about it. Yeah, so I agree with you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi Mark, thank you for that talk. As an agnostic, presumably you don't feel comfortable sort of pitching your tent in any of those positions. Is that because you think each of them is problematic in some way, or do you just not like camping and don't want to commit to anything?
The latter point is true, actually. The camping bit. It's weird because I feel that all viewpoints, all worldviews are going to have their problems. We are human. That's no doubt about it. And I guess that I'm very impressed by Plato. I did my PhD on Plato, so I would be, I guess. I think Paul Plato suffers from Platonism, which is not the same thing at all, I don't think. Certainly in terms of his attitude and the way of life that it seeks to encourage. But that's really the fundamental point for me, is that I think a religious way of life, a spiritual way of life, even a scientific way of life, is to commit to a way of life. And you can't, that's not just a detail, it's going to take you somewhere if you commit to it. And so I agree that choice is a very nice thing, but to live you have to make commitments, and I think that's absolutely right. But nonetheless, the way of life you commit to will have a big impact upon how you come to view things. So you've got to pick a good one. I mean, personally, I do go to church, and so like, kind of after this, I went through a sort of atheistic phase, and then realised that Christianity, as it were, is in the air we breathe in this country, and it's a fantastically rich tradition, and so I went for that, but with this sort of slightly agnostic hue, you might say.
Thank you.
you ended up saying towards the end that there was a loss of confidence in philosophy. But you seem to me to be sort of talking about that it's not just the necessity of living with uncertainty, but the desirability of it. If none of these camps is where we can camp ourselves, so to speak, that it seems to me we've had a sort of pendulum swing. You've heard about Hans Kuhn talking about an instinctive opposition to a religious worldview, which I suppose would probably have emerged, at least in the Enlightenment, and certainly in the 19th century. There seemed to be a pendulum swung to the point of saying that sciences will provide answers, as if somehow the human condition leads us to expect an answer sometime in some unknowable future. Is it not better and more interesting to live with the uncertainty that the philosophers have always expected us to live with? In other words, do we really need answers?
I think perhaps we do need answers, but maybe we can try and hold them a bit more lightly than we might do otherwise. It's sort of a relatively questioning creature, but we questions I do love to find some answers, at least that you might be able to hold on to for a while. But I think perhaps at the same time, it's a capacity to have a relationship with that which is a mystery. Ultimately, that is the difficulty and the challenge, and religious traditions at their best do this very well, I think. Dogma is a very ambivalent word these days, but it strikes me that the best kind of dogma, certainly in Christianity, is both a sort of answer, but that unsettles itself in the very giving of the answer. So just to use a very kind of crude example, the idea that God is three in one. You're basically saying you don't know what God is actually.
But what he is not.
Yeah, and in Orthodox Christianity this is much more explicit, so you have the notion that what God is in God's self is unknowable, but the way that, as it were, the tradition, the richness of many people's experience over a long period of time has come to feel there are three ways, if you like, that we experience the divine. That's not to say that we know what God is in God's self, but it is nonetheless should be good enough, I think you might say, for we humans. Well, that'd be another way of talking about it, for sure, yeah. That'd be another way of talking about it.
The distinction between the immanent trinity and the economic trinity.
Exactly,
yeah. John Polkinghorne, by the way, is very fond of quoting Polanyi about commitments, like commitment what I believe to be true, knowing that it may be false. And he points out the science, but also to this religious belief. What you're putting your science is to the way of life, rather than dogma.
Yeah. Does it make for human flourishing would be a good question to ask, and you pursue the way that you feel it does. I've been very impressed recently because of the interest in John Henry Newman a year or so back when he was he made the same to his beatified? Yeah. Beatified. But I read bits of his, and his notion of assent, A-S-S-E-N-T, I think is a really powerful one actually. And he makes this difference between notional assent, which is just kind of a heady assent, sort of proving, as it were, by mathematics or by evidence and so on, and what he calls real assent. And real assent is that which you give with your whole person, this great effort to bring your whole experience, both your mind and your body, and your way of life, your culture and so on, to bear on the question. I very much like his idea of we need to give real assent to these things, not just notional assent.
Still got a bit of time. There's a question on Wednesday.
Thank you very much.
That's it.
Did you have a comment about...
What's up? Near the microphone.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Mark, picking up your comment, but a sort of throwaway comment really, about metaphors and why they work, and I just wonder whether we take a scientific parallel, really, that scientists throughout the eternity have tried to create small models of the way things are, and they work to a point for a while, and Newton's equations worked for a long while. Einstein came along and showed that they were right in all circumstances. And I wonder whether we use use metaphors in the same way, that we take something we know and we apply it to something which we're trying to understand, and it gives us some insights. And just as with any other model, there's a danger in taking the interpretation too far. And we come to the point where actually the model breaks down in particular circumstances. It's just
I think I'm sure that's right. You know, discernment is always the big issue, the most difficult thing. Yeah.
Any more questions? Yes, what I remember that.
I wondered, Mark, how you, a physicist in you, responds to the issues linked to the Goldilocks universe, and whether you think multiverse is a pop-out.
I'm not really a physicist. I did physics. I'm not a philosopher either. There are real philosophers in the room, so I'm just saying that very clearly. I personally, the multiverse has no appeal to me at all. I suspect, I have little evidence of this, but I suspect it was a speculation on a black hole that suddenly carried a lot of interest for the media. I said as a journalist, and then became, suddenly it was instead of being the strange product of a few equations in string theory, it suddenly became the world actually is. And there's a big gap between those two things. So I guess I quite agree with John Paul really, but it does seem to be slightly desperate.
Going back to that topic myself, from a theistic point
physics, I don't think it matters. I mean, multiverse has been speculated by writers right through the ages. Giordano Bruno did, Thomas Traherne does. So it's not theologically particular. I mean, it comes to the infinity of God. If God's love is infinite, so much of God, the multiplicity of universes. Yeah.
Okay, time for maybe just one quick last one.
If you're not a physicist, I'm really not a physicist, so very great caution here, but I'm struck by what a strange place physics as a, if you like, scientific profession is today, where physicists seem to be arguing amongst themselves about whether, for example, string theory is really proper physics, or whether it's gone beyond any realm of possible testing. And we're also living at a time when, actually a few years ago now, the United States withdrew from an attempt to build a bigger particle accelerator than the one we currently have in Geneva, because it was too expensive. And at the time, you had physicists arguing in public the case for or against spending colossal sums of money in order to push the boundaries of what was experimentally possible. And so I'm looking at these different intriguing places on your map of the meaning of physics and wondering how it translates out or turns into statements about the place of physics itself in our culture. Martin Rees very famously has been at the center of science policy in this country for some years now in various roles. And I think anyone who knows him knows he has a real passion for the future of science, and particularly his science. But we seem to be in an area where physicists are offering alternative visions of, in a sense, of what physics in principle can offer us in return for the sometimes huge investments that our culture is being asked to make on its behalf. And I wonder if you have any observations about that.
Yeah. It strikes me that whatever CERN discovers in terms of physics is absolute master of PR. They discovered absolutely nothing, and yet every week there's like some new story that the media backs up. But
it's a resignation for a wrong discovery.
We've learned a lot about that from that investment. I think physics is a way that we ask these metaphysical questions these days about who we are, where we're from, where we're going, and so on. And you see this very clearly, I think, in the popular presentation of physics. I really like the story that I'm trying to remember his name. Who was the physicist who was a pop star? You know, he's everywhere. Cox, thank you very much. Yeah. And he made this film, this series of TV programs, called The Universe or something, and where he sort of helicopters and stands on tops of mountains in t-shirts and gazes at the sky and so on. And there's a really nice story associated with this that the makers of the programs had a lot of complaints because the music was too loud. The kind of swelling strings and the rising trumpets and whatever. And it said to me that's a real insight into what's really important about these programs. In a way, the music is actually more important than the commentary. And the producer sensed that and so beat the music up, and we perhaps overdid it. But there's something about the physics which it does ask these literal questions, you know, where we are, we're from stardust and so on, but that immediately sparks the imagination, and it's where we project onto the black hole of the universe, you might say, our own internal struggles with these questions. I think actually it's a bit like, I do actually think it's a bit like medieval alchemy. I mean, if you know Carl Jung's ideas about why alchemy was so big, it wasn't the search for gold, it was because in the retort, the alchemists could project all their anxieties and searching and so on about the human quest. And I think that there's a lot of that going on in modern physics as well. It is, I made that point at the beginning, it's the alchemy of our day, but I think perhaps it probably is, yeah.
That's a terrific point on which to end. So, a real treat. Thank you very much.